Welcome everyone. Welcome to the Catalyst Webinar and Dialogue Series. I'm Kendall Marlowe with the Kempe Center for the Prevention and Treatment of Child Abuse and Neglect. Thank you for joining the global community driving change in child welfare. This October, we come together again for the virtual Call to Action to Change Child Welfare Conference. This annual convening of people from across the world aims to transform child welfare and build justice and equity, all through honoring the voices of those impacted by child welfare systems. In both policy and practice, our passionately shared goal is meaningful, lasting transformation. We're here today as part of a webinar series in advance of this fall's conference. In every session of this series, we'll explore actionable initiatives that will come to life in our conference in October. We'll venture unafraid into the heart of child welfare, its history, its impact, and its future. We'll address and even challenge the core structures, policies, laws, and values that have governed our system throughout its history. And we'll ask ourselves, where must we go from here? Following each webinar, then, we'll host a dialogue. Those conversations are intended to foster open, honest, and challenging debate. We invite you to join us at each webinar and then share your voice in each dialogue that follows. If you're viewing this webinar from within Attendee Hub, we encourage your questions and comments through the Q&A feature. If you're with us through Zoom, you can use the chat box function to engage, and we'll have time at the end of the presentation today to address those comments and questions. So looking forward to those from you. For today's webinar session, we welcome Alan J. Dettlaff. Alan is a professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work and began his career in the child welfare system, where he worked as a caseworker and administrator. As an author, his most recent book is Confronting the Racist Legacy of the American Child Welfare System, The Case for Abolition. Alan, thanks for being here today, and let's begin. Talk to us.
Thanks, Kendall. I appreciate the introduction, and thanks to everyone who's joining. I appreciate you all being here and your interest in this topic. As Kendall said, I spent many years working in the child welfare system in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas. And my time in that system, I worked as what the system calls an investigator, meaning that I was responsible for separating children from their families. So that's the lens that I bring to this work. I worked there for many years. And it really wasn't until I left the system that I came to understand the problem of racial disproportionality, which we're going to be talking about a bit today, as well as came to understand the harm that separating children from their parents causes. When I was in the system, the way I think about it now is really as that it was a process of brainwashing that I went through, where parents are bad, children need to be rescued, and taking them away from their parents is the way to do that. As I said, it wasn't until I left the system and became involved in the state of Texas efforts to address disproportionality that I was able to think back on my time in the system and, one, realize that most of the children that I separated from their parents were Black and brown children. But two, there were things that I could have done to prevent removal from happening that I didn't do, that the system didn't talk about. And I was able to also think that not once of all of the children that I separated from their families, not once did any of those children say, "Thank you so much for taking me away from my horrible abusive parent." That never happened, and it never happened because those children loved their parents. And even in cases where harm was occurring, they wanted that harm to stop, but they didn't want to be taken away from their parents. And that's what led me to the work that I do today. And that's what led to this exploration about the racist history of the child welfare system in the book that I wrote last year that Kendall mentioned. And a big part of that book is the racist history of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with some slides. Okay. So today, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about the racist legacy of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974, which I know many people call CAPTA. And I wanted to start just with a brief overview of racial disproportionality and disparities. I know that many of you listening are already very familiar with this topic. But as you know, racial disproportionality refers to the overrepresentation of a certain group of children in the child welfare system. And typically, when we talk about racial disproportionality, we're speaking about the overrepresentation of Black children in the system who are overrepresented in foster care at a rate almost double their proportion of children in the general population. That racial disproportionality exists because Black children are more likely to be engaged in the child welfare system at every level of service delivery, from reports to hotlines, to investigations, to confirmed cases of maltreatment. And then Black children are almost twice as likely as white children to be forcibly separated from their parents and placed into foster care. What's important to understand about racial disproportionality is that this has been a problem known to the system since the earliest origins of the system, since going back to the 1960s. This center picture here is a book called Children of the Storm, which was written in 1972, documenting the overrepresentation of Black children in the system, the racism inherent in the child welfare system throughout the 1960s. And this was the first book to really document the overrepresentation of Black children in the system, what we call now racial disproportionality. The book on the left side by Marion Harris, that was written in about 2015. Then I edited a book that came out just in 2021 on racial disproportionality and disparities on the right side of the system. So this is a problem that has been well known to the system for at least 60 years now, and the system has been unable to do anything about it, in large part due to the policies that have been put in place in the system that reinforce the racism that's embedded in the system, that reinforce middle-class white parenting standard by which all other families are judged against, that maintain the disproportionality that we see today. So as many of you probably know, there is some debate about why racial disproportionality and disparities exist. The presence of disproportionality is not up for debate, but why that occurs is a debate for some. There are some who will point to conditions of poverty as the largest driving factor, while there are others who will point to the system itself and the racism that's inherent in the system. I'm going to talk a bit about both of those things because both are true to some extent. But I think when we talk about why racial disproportionality and disparities exist, it's really important to start at the beginning and acknowledge that the forcible separation of Black children from their parents has been happening in the United States for over 400 years. And that started during the era of chattel slavery, where up to 2/3 of enslaved families experienced some form of family separation. And that family separation, the selling of children away from their parents, the selling of parents away from their children, was used as a form of punishment to maintain compliance of enslaved people and maintain their subjugation. What's important to understand about this era of our history is that we sometimes look at the separations that occurred during slavery and think that that was an isolated incident or an artifact of history. But when you look at what happened following abolition of slavery, we see that children, Black children, continued to be enslaved through what the state then called indentured servitudes, or forced apprenticeships, through laws called the Black Codes that allowed, in many cases, children to be the apprentice of their former slave masters. And we know that throughout history, the state has separated other groups of children from their families. We know that Indigenous children were separated and placed in boarding schools. We know that children were forcibly separated from their families during the era of the Japanese internment camps. Throughout history, the government has used the forcible separation of children from their families as a tool to maintain their oppression. And that's the foundation on which the child welfare system has been based. This is another image of a family separation that was done during slavery. And this was part of an image in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this image is important because Uncle Tom's Cabin was the most widely read book of the 1800s. And these stories of family separation, in many cases, led to the abolition movement increasing, particularly among Northern families. The horror, the trauma of family separation was so visceral and so felt by people that that's ultimately what led to many white Northerners joining the abolition movement. And then we see some of the consequences of that. Those centuries of forced family separation, and then even after slavery was abolished, Black codes, Jim Crow laws that allowed legal racism, legal discrimination through 1964, when that was declared unconstitutional. But what we see are the consequences of that. That's today why we have disproportionate rates of Black families who live in poverty. That's why we have things like the education gap, the wealth gap, the employment gap. That's why we have racial disparities in health and mental health outcomes. And that's why we have racial disparities in terms of geographic context, where we see widespread racial residential segregation, a history of racist policies, such as how the GI Bill was implemented, where only about 2% of Black veterans who were eligible for housing through the GI Bill actually received housing. All of these things are the intended consequences of laws that were put in place following slavery. So when you hear people talk about disproportionate need being the reason why Black children are overrepresented in the child welfare system, all of the conditions associated with disproportionate need, and particularly disproportionate rates of poverty, are the direct result of policy decisions that were made by the United States government following abolition of slavery. And that then leads us to the racist history of the child welfare system. So we have racial disproportionality in the child welfare system today because of a combination of policy decisions that were made at the federal level by the government in society that were constitutional through passage of the Civil Rights Act. But then we also have the racist history of the child welfare system, and CAPTA is a big part of that. But that racist history really starts in 1935 with passage of the Social Security Act and aid to dependent children. Really, the concept of child welfare began here in the 1930s, and it was intended primarily as a poverty relief program for white widowed mothers to prevent them from needing to enter the workforce. This initially started at the state level, but then passage of the Social Security Act and creation of aid to dependent children program federalized that system. So child welfare was initially intended primarily for white widowed mothers so that they would not have to enter the workforce. But then as more Black families began to meet the eligibility requirements of ADC, what we saw is that states started to implement eligibility requirements in the form of what people refer to as illegitimate child clauses or other home suitability clauses that allowed states to deny or even expel Black families whose homes were viewed as immoral. As examples of that, in 1959, the state of Florida removed over 14,000 children from their welfare program because of these unsuitability clauses. Over 90% of those children were Black. The following year, the state of Louisiana expelled 23,000 children from ADC, again, the majority of whom were Black on these grounds of unsuitability. What we saw then is there was public outrage about these families, enough public outrage about these families being expelled to lead to what's known as the Fleming Rule, which was named after Arthur Fleming, who was the head of DHHS at that time. The Fleming Rule prohibited states from denying ADC to families due to these unsuitability clauses. But the law also required that states investigate homes of families who were kicked off the welfare rolls to see if those homes were unsuitable or unsafe, and then either provide income assistance to those families or place children in foster care. An intervention that was greatly expanded in 1962 through the public welfare amendments of the Social Security Act, which for the first time provided federal reimbursement for foster care. So what we see is tens of thousands of Black families, Black children expelled from welfare rolls, and then subsequently investigated by white social workers, and then placed in foster care because they were deemed unsafe. So the combination of those policy changes is what led to what we now call the start of racial disproportionality. But then understanding how racial disproportionality is maintained today is really through examining CAPTA and understanding the racist intents embedded within CAPTA, the legislation that defined child maltreatment and established requirements for mandatory reporting of child maltreatment. Both of these things really served as foundations for the system's current architecture. So as a little background of how we got to CAPTA, prior to the 1960s and the formation of the modern child welfare system, except for some very severe incidents with very severe harm, the public was largely unaware of what would later become known as child abuse. It was a private matter. Parents were responsible for their children, and child abuse wasn't something that was reported. There was no such thing as mandatory reporting laws in the early 1960s. That all changed in 1962, following publication of C. Henry Kemp's The Battered Child Syndrome, which for the first time brought this issue of severe physical harm of children into the public consciousness. Coverage of the battered child syndrome was in Newsweek, Time Magazine, the Saturday Evening Post, huge national coverage that firmly established this newly identified issue of child abuse as a national concern. And we saw that that led to swift implementation of mandatory reporting laws across the country and an explosion in reporting. So after the Battered Child Syndrome was published between 1963 and 1968, that was the rise of mandatory reporting laws. In 1962, when no state mandatory reporting laws existed, fewer than 700 cases of what was called cruelty to children were reported to the police across the country. However, by 1968, when mandatory reporting laws were in effect in all 50 states, reporting of cases of child abuse surged from 700 to 11,000. So just over this period of 5 years, reporting of child abuse went from 700 to 11,000 as a result of these mandatory reporting laws. And what we saw is that the impact on Black children and families was immediate. In 1968, Black children were reported for child abuse at a rate exceeding 3 times that of white children. Black children specifically accounted for nearly half of all reports, 45% of reports, despite comprising only 8% of the population. So it's within this context of growing national concern about child abuse, along with this rapid surge in reporting that disproportionately impacted families, that Congress began hearings for the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act that ultimately became law in 1974. And CAPTA marked the first effort of the federal government to institute a mandate for the reporting law, aiming to unify these existing state laws. And CAPTA represented the key piece of legislation that was needed to fully transform this system that started as a support for white families living in poverty to one that would ultimately come to surveil and separate Black families because of their poverty. And that's because before CAPTA, the inclusion of neglect as an area of concern was inconsistent at best in these state mandatory reporting laws, as it diverged from the original intent of the laws. If you remember, the whole child abuse concern started because of the battered child syndrome and this issue of severe child abuse, or severe physical abuse specifically. But CAPTA dangerously grouped child neglect alongside child abuse under this broader category of child maltreatment, solidifying the idea that parents who were facing challenges meeting their children's needs because of poverty were responsible for maltreatment. And even though there was an abundance of evidence highlighting the relationship between poverty and neglect, along with this disproportionality of reporting of Black families, the proponents of CAPTA intentionally obscured that in order to pass the bill. Attorney Don Lash later wrote about this in his book, When the Welfare People Come. He said, the effect is to obscure the institutional racism in which poverty and its consequent problems for children are rooted, and to focus on the perceived failures and pathology of people caught up in the system. What's important to understand is that was by design. The racism that's embedded within CAPTA is not a coincidence. You'll often hear people talk about the unintended consequences of CAPTA, but they're not unintended. Think about it this way. Legislators and policymakers who advocated for passage of CAPTA had nearly a decade of information telling them that not only is poverty deeply conflated with neglect, but also that the reporting that we've been seeing over the last 5 to 6 years is deeply and negatively impacting Black families, disproportionately impacting Black families. But with all of that information, CAPTA served as the definitive policy decision that solidified all of those disparities and ensured they would persist. So what began as a system for widowed white mothers to protect them from poverty was now a system to surveil and punish Black families to protect their children from that poverty for which Black families were deemed responsible. So this wasn't an unintended consequence. If you know that passage of a policy or passage of legislation is going to harm Black families, and you have evidence that if you are to pass that policy, that will severely and disproportionately harm Black families, but you pass that legislation anyways, that's not unintended. That's the clearly foreseeable outcome that's going to happen. And what's important to also understand about this time in our history, think 1963 to 1968, when state mandatory reporting laws are arising, and then all of the hearings that happened in the early 1970s related to CAPTA. This coincided with the exact same time in history as the civil rights movement. So you have this time in history where mandatory reporting laws are being passed throughout all 50 states in the country, that included some of the most horrific acts of violence directed against Black Americans since the era of slavery. The lynching of Emmett Till, the blocking of the Little Rock Nine from entering Central High School, violence directed at the Freedom Riders throughout the South, the blocking of Black students from entering the University of Alabama, of the assassination of Malcolm X, the violence of the Selma marchers. All of this violent backlash and the widely held racial animus during this time formed the backdrop to the rapid expansion of mandatory reporting laws that were the direct result of the battered child syndrome. So what we see is evidence that throughout our history as a country, when white power is threatened, it responds with what Carol Anderson calls white rage. We see at various times throughout our history that white rage has manifested through horrific violence, like the violence we saw during the era of slavery, where violence was used to both prevent rebellion and as a response to rebellion, to the violence inflicted on Black Americans during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. But then we see at other times in history when overt physical violence is either deemed insufficient or less supported by the broader society, white rage is enacted through policy. From the Black codes to the Jim Crow laws to the mandatory reporting laws that were established through CAPTA, policy has been the tool used by the state to channel white rage for the maintenance of white power. And we see that being effective in the intended consequences of CAPTA. What we know today is that 53% of Black children will be subject to a family policing investigation by the time they turn 18. Think about that number, 53%. More than 1 in 2 of every Black child who's born in the United States are going to be investigated by child welfare agents by the time they turn 18. Today, Black children are 2 times as likely to be forcibly separated from their parents than white children. In some states, that's a rate of nearly 3 times that of white children. In total, 1 in 11 of every Black child born in the United States will be forcibly separated from their parents by the time they turn 18. In some states, that's as high as 1 in 8 of every Black child born in that state will be forcibly separated from their parents. And we also know not only is the act of family separation harmful to children and their parents, but we also know the consequences of those family separations and what happens to children who are placed in foster care. Today, we know through decades of research that children who are placed in foster care have delinquency rates that are 2 to 3 times higher that of children who are not placed in foster care. We also know that children who experience time in foster care have higher teen birth rates, have lower earnings as adults. They're twice as likely to have learning disabilities and developmental delays. They're 6 times more likely to have behavioral problems. They're more likely to have substance-related disorders, psychotic or bipolar disorders, depression and anxiety disorders. and they have arrest rates that are 2 to 3 times higher and more likely to have criminal convictions for violent offenses. These are the direct and intended consequences of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. And it's important to point out here that foster care is harmful to all children, and all children who are forcibly separated from their families and spend time in foster care are at risk of experiencing these consequences. But because we live in a racist society where Black children are already at greater risk of experiencing some of these outcomes, more likely to be incarcerated, more likely to have contact with the juvenile or adult criminal legal systems, more likely to have substance use disorders, more likely to be living in poverty, more likely to experience houselessness. Because of the racism in the United States that makes it more likely for Black children to experience those events, when we then add on top of that forcible family separation, placement in foster care where those children don't know when or if they're ever going to see their families again, that makes it all the more likely that Black children and families, or that Black children are going to experience these outcomes. And think about these outcomes here: poverty, houselessness, substance use, psychotic disorders, incarceration. Those are the outcomes in the United States, or the conditions in the United States, that maintain the oppression of Black Americans. Those are the outcomes that maintain the white supremacy that exists in our society. So really, when you think about that, the child welfare system acts as an agent of oppression by knowingly inflicting an intervention disproportionately on Black children and families that they know is going to result in these outcomes. So the child welfare system now in today's society has become a tool that maintains the oppression of Black Americans, and it all started with Kempe. And that is why I and many of others are involved in the Up In movement, which is a movement that seeks to dismantle the existing child welfare system entirely. Because at the Up In system, we believe that we can build a society where children and families are strengthened and supported rather than being surveilled and separated. Many of you are probably familiar with the abolitionist movement. In the last 4 or 5 years, there have been many of us advocating for something different, a different response to children and families who are in need that doesn't cause the harm that we know results from family separation. And we know that we can do that. In addition to the decades of information that I talked about that we know causes harm to children who are forcibly separated from their families and placed in foster care, we also know that forcible family separation is not necessary in many of those cases. And we know that because we know that up to 70% of children who are forcibly separated from their families and put in foster care are forcibly separated and put in foster care because of this category that CAPTA defined called neglect, which is largely associated with poverty. So think about what the child welfare system is today. It's a system that forcibly separates hundreds of thousands of children from their parents. Up to 70% of those children are forcibly separated solely because of poverty. So we take those children away from their parents, and then we put them in a home with a stranger that we call a foster parent, and then we give that stranger money to take care of somebody else's children when all those children's parents need is money. In Texas, we give foster parents about $1,000 a month to take care of somebody else's children. What if we just gave those children's parents $1,000 a month so that they have what they need to adequately care for their children? We could dramatically reduce the number of children who are entering foster care. And we know also from research that direct financial assistance significantly reduces contact with child welfare systems and significantly reduces incidents of maltreatment. So we know that there are other strategies outside of family separation that, one, don't cause the same kind of harm that family separation causes, but two, we know that direct material assistance works. So at the Up In movement, we've written a lot about how we can get to this place of abolishing the child welfare system and really prioritizing the needs of families through a publication we call How We End Up, A Future Without Family Policing. And these are some of the things that we're calling for. Ending involuntary separations of children, reuniting children who are currently in foster care, ending surveillance of families, repealing the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974, prioritizing care over punishment, providing families with what they need, transforming societal conditions, meaning passing legislation like universal basic income, like guaranteed child allowances that we know through research are effective in meeting families' needs, reimagining care for children and families in ways that don't cause harm, and then ultimately shifting power to families as first responders, rather than having this model where professionals and in many states, just other community members are required to report families for any suspicion of concern for child abuse or neglect. We believe that power should lie with families and communities. When families and communities know that a family is in need, that they're the people that respond to that family. They help that family find the resources that they need, and they help ensure that if harm is occurring, that harm isn't occurring again. As I mentioned, I wrote about this a lot in this book, Confronting the Racist Legacy of the American Child Welfare System. There's a whole chapter dedicated to Kempe and how that formed the basis of this racist legacy. So I hope that you'll take a look at that. And I think now we have some time for some questions. I'll turn it back over to you, Kendall.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you. And let me encourage everyone, we've already gotten a few, but hop on in. Again, on Attendee Hub, you use the Q&A feature on Zoom. Just pop things into chat. So let's start giving Alan some questions here. So Alan, here's one. Given the intended consequences for children who are separated from their families, why do we still call it foster care?
Yeah, that's a great question. And similar to why we call it the child welfare system, or why many people call it the child welfare system. We call it those things because that's language that's been given to us by the state, by the government, as an intentional means of distorting the reality of what's happening in the system. When you really look at the system is, think of the child welfare system. The system is not concerned with children's welfare. Again, going back to this idea that 70% of children are in foster care because of poverty-related concerns, if the system were really concerned with children's welfare, we would address those poverty-related concerns. But if a child or a family comes to the attention of the system, say a case that many of you are probably familiar with, where a mother makes a decision to go to work and leave her child at home alone because she can't afford daycare. So that mother has a decision. Stay home with her child because she can't afford daycare, and then the result will be that she doesn't go to work and will likely be fired from her employment, where in many states employment is at will, and in many minimum wage jobs employment is at will. So what is the mother's need in that situation? She needs daycare. The child welfare system is not going to provide her with daycare. The child welfare system will take that child away and put that child in the home with a foster parent, and then they'll send that parent to parenting classes. They'll send that parent to get a psychological evaluation. If that parent becomes upset or angry or distressed about these interventions, then they'll send that parent to anger management classes. That parent doesn't need any of that. She needs money. She needs daycare. If the child welfare system were concerned with that child's welfare, it would provide the parent with daycare so she can go to her job and make money to meet her child's needs. That's the same reason that we continue to call it foster care. It is not foster care. I say often that foster care is the same as a jail or a prison cell or an immigration detention camp. It's all forms of forced incarceration, whether it's a prison cell, immigration detention, a foster home. It's all part of this carceral web that exists today to ensure that white people stay on top. That's what the child welfare system exists for. And that's why we keep calling it foster care.
Another question. Someone says, I think that social workers are trying to do what is best for children, keeping them safe. Do you think that social workers believe that they are doing the right thing by separating Black families? Could we attenuate disproportionality with more Black social workers?
Mhm. That's a really good question. Let me think. There's multiple questions in there, so let me see. Um, I absolutely think that many social workers think that they're helping children and families by engaging in the work that the child welfare system does. As I said, I was one of those people. I really look at it now as a form of brainwashing, where removal is viewed as the only option to help families, and it's happening to so many families around you that you buy into that idea that separating children from their families is the way to save them. The system doesn't talk about how harmful family separation is. The system doesn't talk about the horrible outcomes that children who are separated and experience foster care have. Um, so I think sometimes it's difficult when you're in the system to separate yourself and see the harm. But I think it's important for social workers who are working in that system to be able to identify that. One of the things that was part of the question was something related to, do social workers think they're keeping children safe? What's important to understand there is that the child welfare system does not keep children safe. In addition to the immense harm that the system causes by taking children away from their parents, we know that rates of physical and sexual abuse in foster care are 2 to 3 times higher than they are in the general population. So one, the system is harming children by separating them from their families, but then two, they're putting children in conditions where they're even more likely to experience additional harm. So we have to get rid of this idea that the child welfare system is keeping children safe, because they're not. Kendall, can you repeat the last part of that question?
Yes. Could we attenuate disproportionality with more Black social workers?
No, because if this really has nothing to do with the race of the caseworker. In many systems, and particularly in urban areas, the racial makeup of social workers is predominantly Black. Um, the outcomes that we see in today's child welfare system aren't because of racist individuals. The outcomes that we see are because of racist policies. So regardless of the race of the caseworker, when those policies are implemented, it's going to result in racist outcomes. Um, so it has nothing to do with the racial makeup of the caseworker. It has nothing to do with the desire of caseworkers to help children. The policies themselves are racist, and when they're implemented, they'll result in racist outcomes.
Another question. Do you see a need for any version of child protection? For example, for child sexual abuse or serious physical harm, and what might that look like?
Mhm. Absolutely. I think it's really important, and I'm glad this question came up, because I think sometimes abolitionists, people who do the work that I do, are wrongly accused of not caring about harm to children that may result if the system is abolished. I think it's really abolitionists care the most about children's safety, which is why we want to stop the harm that results to children from family separation and the harm that results to children in foster care. But absolutely, there is a need for child protection. We just don't think the responsibility for that protection should be the state. We think that that should be families and communities. And the best way that I've been able to think about this is to ask all of you watching to think about yourself and your family, the network of people that you love and care about. And imagine that a child in that network is harmed severely. What would you want to happen? Would you want the government to come and take that child away from you and to decide what happens to that child? Or would you want to get together as a family and as a community, as a network of people who love each other, and figure out what needs to happen to protect that child from future harm? I think most people, when faced with that choice, would choose the latter option. They would choose to get together as a family and decide what needs to happen to protect that child. If you want that option for your family, then you should want that option for every family. And if you want that option for every family, then you're an abolitionist.
Another question, how can those of us working within the system now help to change it?
That's such a tough question because, again, as we were just talking about, it's the policies um, that are resulting in the racist outcomes. So no matter how many well-intentioned people are in the system, until the policies are changed, the outcomes aren't going to change. So the best way to be involved in working for change is to be working on efforts to change those policies. There is a large network of people working right now to repeal CAPTA. They even have a website, it's repealcapta.org. And they're working to repeal mandatory reporting laws across states and then ultimately to repeal CAPTA at the federal level. That's ultimately the only thing that's going to change how the child welfare system operates. There's also a network of people who are working to repeal ASFA, the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which allows for the termination of parental rights. So be involved in these large kind of macro efforts to change the policies that are leading to the racist outcomes. Then I'd also say if you're in the system and you understand and acknowledge the harm of family separation, the disproportionate harm that results to Black children and families, educate people around you. Educate people around you about the harm that results. Educate people around you about how much children love their parents and how much parents love their children, even in cases where harm is occurring. And educate people, the other part that I think is important is educating people about the failure of reforms. Think about the time that you've been in the system yourself and the number of reform efforts that you've witnessed. And think about the reality of the system, the fact that the racial disproportionality that exists in the system today is nearly the same as the racial disproportionality that existed when the system first started. All of these decades of reform never result in any meaningful substantive change. And the reason those reforms never result in meaningful change is because they never address the foundational intervention on which the system is built, which is forcible family separation. Even think about the system's current efforts to reform, which are largely built around this idea of racial equity. What would happen if the system achieves racial equity? That would mean that the system still forcibly separates hundreds of thousands of children from their families every year. It's just equitably proportioned by race. What good is that? Equitable harm is still harm. So for those of you who are in the system, we have to push back on these continuous reform efforts that we know are ultimately not going to change much.
What do you see? Here's another question. What do you see as the major impediment of realigning what we pay foster parents to what we pay parents to support their needs and address neglect?
Yeah, that's such an important question too. And the impediment, and this is a difficult one to get past, is societal views about providing people in need with help. And this comes from what people call a bootstraps mentality. We pathologize individuals for being poor, meaning we blame them and their decision making for why they're living in poverty, rather than looking at the government as being responsible for the poverty that people live in through policy choices. And we have a difficult time thinking that it's okay to use our tax dollars to provide funds to families, to provide direct money to families in need, because we think that they're in need because of their own poor decision making, not decisions made by the government. That's the barrier. If you think about the example I gave where I said, why don't we just give the parent in need the $1,000 instead of the foster parent? I've been in webinar sessions like this before where people have said, well, how do we know that mom's not going to use that money for drugs? That's how we've been conditioned into society to think about poor mothers and particularly poor Black mothers. How do we know the foster parent's not going to use that money for drugs? We don't. But we've been conditioned over time, going back to stereotypes about the welfare queens and war on drugs, to think that this is what people living in poverty are going to do if we were to help them. get out of poverty. That's the real barrier that we have to get past, that we as a society have a responsibility to meet the needs of people who are living in poverty. And we actually have the means to do it. The government could decide to solve poverty tomorrow if they wanted to.
And Alan, do you have a couple more minutes? We got another question or two here we'd like to address.
Yeah.
Someone's wondering if you're familiar with the now late scholar Gary Melton, his work for the Strong Communities Framework. If you're familiar with that, is that the kind of thing that would fit into a model system to explore?
I'm not familiar enough with it to be able to give you a good answer about that. Sorry about that.
But you have been arguing for a family, a network, a system of family and community support. As you were talking about this earlier, and I can't remember the sociologist who coined these terms, Ellen, but it seemed to me you were talking about the concept of the deserving poor versus the undeserving poor.
For sure.
And we have somehow placed kids in foster care and their families into that undeserving poor category, haven't we?
Absolutely. Yeah, what we're advocating for is that families and communities have all of the resources that they need to care for each other. So when I gave the example about families and communities making the decisions about how to protect a child who's being harmed, there's two components there. It's one, the families and communities have that responsibility rather than the government, but it also preassumes that the resources that families need exist in those communities. So, and those resources are things like universal basic income, housing guarantees, access to free and accessible health care, mental health care, substance use care for anyone who needs it. So it's the combination of those resources being available and then the responsibility for decision-making lying with families and communities, not with the government.
And in that vein, Alan, if we can just end then on this comment made by an attendee, so brilliant and articulate, makes me want to run for public office to have the power to change things. Incredible.
Excellent. And I hope you do that, because this really is about changing political will in order to bring about the conditions that we need to repeal some of these harmful policies.
And our only other note here that just came in, Alan, is a rebuttal to that. Someone saying, actually, Alan, you should run for office. So thank you, Ellen Dettlaff. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this. Again, we will have a dialogue session that will follow this. You will be receiving notice of that, where we'll have more time to engage in a dialogue about all of the issues and insights that Alan has brought us today. Thank you, Ellen Dettlaff, and thank you, everyone, for participating today. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.